Hey, Armand here with the forecast for Venus retrograde 2023. Venus is retrograde from July 22nd to September 3rd of 2023. And we have to deal with the shadow period before that, which we've already talked about in other forecasts. And we have to deal with the shadow period afterwards, which I'll address now. At the beginning of the video, I'm going to give you an overview of Venus retrograde, tell you what it's going to affect and what it's not going to affect, sort of strategize for it. And then towards the end, I'll give you a more specific forecast, including looking back at previous Venus retrogrades, because one of the things about Venus retrograde is that it's possible to look back. There's a cyclical nature to it. And in my videos and blog posts on Venus retrograde, as brilliant as they are, never been very popular, which is probably due in part to the message of Venus retrograde, which is not wonderful, I suppose, and also the fact that when it happens, Venus is retrograde, and so enthusiasm is going to kind of be lacking. That doesn't mean that you can't like or subscribe, though. You don't feel obligated not to think much of it. If you want to, go right ahead. So let's think about Venus retrograde. It is a period where we back away from our indulgences. It's a period where we back away from pleasure. Already it sounds terrible, right? There are a lot of correlates with the 40 days of Venus retrograde. For example, there was the 40 days of the flood, biblical correlates there. Now, if you think about it from the perspective of being, a human or an animal, this was just a big catastrophe that had to be weathered. But, the story is that, God wanted to sort of purify things, wanted to wipe out the impurities and start fresh. That's kind of the energy of Venus retrograde. And then we had Jesus's 40 days in the desert, and that was, again, a time of backing away, going within. It was a period of retreat. That's kind of something to think about with Venus retrograde. The 40 years of wandering in the desert that happened previously, that is kind of that's a reverse secondary progression. Instead of being a day for a year, it's a year for a day. But that's also 40. And finally, we have most relevant and most easy to get a handle on, I think at least for Catholics and some Christians, is the idea of Lent, the roughly 40 days before Easter, which is a time when you give something up. That was always a big thing. You give something up for Lent. Catholics will not have meat on Fridays, or sometimes Wednesdays and Fridays. The vegetarian pescatarians among us are not terribly impressed, but it's a good effort anyway, right? You give something up. It's hard to give something up for 40 days. It's hard to back away from pleasures and indulgences for 40 days. And yet that's what we're asked to do with Venus retrograde. Now, one thing is just, Venus is not going forward, so our pleasures and indulgences are unlikely to go forward, right? So part of it is just strategy. If Venus is in retrograde, then we're not really going to make much progress when it comes to the pleasures, the indulgences. So it makes sense to sort of keep low expectations. On the other hand, profitably, we can look at this as a period of retreat. We can look at it as a period where we go within, where we appreciate more what we have. We appreciate simplicity. So if you're not going to the 4-star restaurant and ordering the big dinner and all of that, maybe you could appreciate your home cooked food a little bit more. Maybe you could take the time to make a nice meal and really enjoy what you have. If you go out to the restaurant, and by all means, lots of people are you could have a pretty good time. It's probably not gonna feel quite the way you wanted it to feel. It may feel a little hollow, and that's what happens when we do Venus things when Venus is retrograde. Here's a little thing, though, to keep in mind. It's true of Mercury retrograde, it's true of Mars retrograde, and it's very true of Venus retrograde. When a planet is retrograde, it is actually closer to the Earth. It is brighter in the sky. We feel its energy very powerfully. Very powerfully. It's not like Venus disappears from the sky. Venus is out there blazing. Well, then eventually she gets covered by the sun. Let's not get into the astronomy of it. But right before, when she stations, very, very bright in the sky. We feel the energy when the planet is retrograde. When Mercury is retrograde, you kind of want to go out and you want to get new computer software or a new computer, or you're thinking maybe I should buy a car. I can't tell you how many times clients are saying, I want to get a cell phone, but Mercury's retrograde. But it's okay because I'm replacing my phone, so it's okay, right? But we want to do the things that the planet is signifying. We want to do Venus things when Venus is retrograde. So it's not like we're thinking, wow, I really feel like going on retreat and not having any fun. No, you're feeling like, gee, I'd really like to do Venusian things. Let's talk about what they are. So we start out with, well, we'll just list romance, finance, and aesthetics. And don't think aesthetics is going to be not important. So romance, though, let's start with romance. You probably want to know about romance. It is considered to be a relatively poor time to begin a new romantic relationship. The energy is just lacking, although we feel the energy strongly. We'd love to have a new relationship. We think this could be wonderful. I'm looking for this. I want this. Very, very Venusian. So the energy is lacking. So we find people are ready for it. They're looking for it. And of course, everybody feels the Venus retrograde energy. So it's not that hard to find somebody else who will say, yeah, me too. The problem is that romances that begin with Venus retrograde often fizzle relatively quickly. Okay, so I had a client and he met a woman, they fell in love, they moved in, and they broke up all within the 40 days of a Venus retrograde. Now, I'm an astrologer. I collect stories like that. They gravitate to me so I can have good stories to tell. I tell good stories during Mercury retrograde and Venus retrograde and so on. It's unlikely to be anything as dramatic as that for any of you or any of us. That's an example from an extreme that shows exactly how things can go if you invest in it. More than likely, what happens is you meet somebody and it feels pretty good. It's exciting. It's very exciting at the beginning because all this internal energy, right? The planet is strong in the sky. It's just not going forward. And so what happens is that the energy dissipates. It's like a quick flash in the pan kind of thing. To be honest, I would bet that a lot of us would not mind having a quick flash in the pan relationship that doesn't last very long, but is intense and exciting. And it's, something shows up on the radar. That's pretty good for a lot of folks. And, there you go. If you can keep your expectations in line with that, then, by all means, go forward. And anyway, if you meet somebody and you think it's great, of course you have to go forward with it anyway. I mean, what are you going to do? If you meet somebody who's great and you say, well, Venus is retrograde, so I'm not going to go out with you. And then you lose your opportunity. And then that was how Venus retrograde screwed with your whole relationship picture. So you've got to do it. You just want to keep a little thing in your head. Go, well, we'll see how this goes. Keep part of you out to be the observer, the assessor of the situation. Now, a lot of folks ask about old lovers coming back. Do old lovers come back when Venus is retrograde? And the answer is it does happen. I think it happens more than at other times. Maybe the prevalence is a little bit more. The prominence is certainly more, though. Let's think about what really happens. First of all, the vast majority of the time, they just show up to say hi. They give you a call because, did I leave my something there? Did I leave my electric toothbrush there? Is the charging base with you? Because I don't have it anymore. Yeah, it could be that kind of thing. Or you just run into somebody in town or something like that. Very frequently, you just see them. They remind you that they were in your life in a different capacity than they are now. And that's it. That's basically the most typical lovers coming back with Venus retrograde. Once in a while, old flames do get rekindled with Venus retrograde. And then we have two possibilities. Once in a while, a romance that was truly meant to be something that was absolutely wonderful but got derailed for some reason at some point in the past winds up coming back and everything is good and it really is a resolution. That happens. More likely, though, you meet the person and you think, oh wow, yeah, this was, they were hot. Let's see what happens. That's with depends where your moon is, of course. Depends a lot upon your moon sign. But sometimes you think about the past with, this nice sort of rose-colored sentimental glasses. You sort of forget the difficult times and just sort of remember the positive times. And so you think of going backwards and so on. Maybe it's not so bad. And in that case, you very frequently find out, oh no, it really wasn't so great. There's a reason why they're my ex. That's the more typical outcome of that. Again, you kind of, you have to be aware of what the possibilities are. But on the other hand, you also have to live your life. So whatever comes up, and you go through it, and you deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly as it turns out, and you say, oh well, Venus is retrograde, and either Armand was right or Armand was right. So you don't not do things, especially in the area of romance, because you got to go with your heart, and there's lessons to be learned, I'm sure. So go with it. Now, within existing relationships, Venus retrograde shouldn't have much to do with anything. If your relationship is in a good place, don't expect Venus retrograde to really have much of an effect at all. Yeah, I mean, perhaps things will slow down a little bit. Sexually, things may cool down just a little bit with Venus retrograde, maybe. Or, it could heat up for that matter. See what happens. But for existing relationships, Venus retrograde probably won't have much of an effect. It's not like it's going to tear your relationship apart or anything. If your relationship is in a more challenging place, if you're not in a good spot, if things are kind of, up in the air, then Venus retrograde could be a period of time where you have to deal with issues and it could be a little bit more unsettled. So be aware of that. Now, finance. Here we have a little bit more care that needs to be taken because, this isn't about going with your heart. This is about going with your pocketbook. And so I would say this is not a great time for speculative investments. It's not a great time for gambling, but it's not a great time for anything that is a speculative investment. Okay, something, again, could seem very good. And yeah, you might miss out on something that's very good, but you want to be very, very careful with Venus retrograde. It is a uniquely poor time to have something assessed or appraised. That plays into people that are buying homes, because when you're going to buy a home or sell your home for that matter, you have to get it appraised or assessed. Somebody has to set a value for it, right? Typically, there are people come in and actually do appraisals on houses, in order to get a mortgage and things like that. But regardless, you still have to be able to sell. And when you sell or you buy, there has to be a price, right? And that price could be well above, which is not good if you're the buyer, or well below, which is not great if you're the seller, what it otherwise would be. It's hard to get an accurate valuation. So you want to be very careful. You don't want to take your jewelry to get appraised or assessed. Just in general, you don't want to have things appraised or assessed with Venus retrograde. You want to be cautious with finances. It's not a disaster. It's not a disaster, but you have to be cautious with finances. Now, aesthetics. Well, aesthetics and pleasure in general. Okay, what you think is beautiful. With Venus retrograde, it's not a great time for, let's say, buying luxury items. Now, don't buy the luxury items with Venus retrograde. It's not a good time for buying artwork or anything like that. That's a big thing now, people buying artwork as investments. I would be, I wouldn't buy an NFT. I wouldn't buy an NFT on any day, but certainly wouldn't want to do it. Certainly wouldn't want to do it now. I would say that in general, it is a time where new creative projects might have a hard time getting off the ground. Existing creative projects would probably be good if you go back and you kind of redo things. This it'd be a great time if you're making an album. Let's say if you're a musician, you're making an album, this would be a great time to go back and do the producing on it, to go out and remaster and all of that to come up with something that is an ideal product. You probably have to wait for Venus to go direct in order to launch it. It's interesting that some products that come out with Venus retrograde do really, really well, and some really, really fizzle. And that's about the way I would expect it to go. So it depends. Here's your bravery test, huh? If you're feeling that you got something that will stand up to Venus retrograde, go right ahead. It's happened many times before. But creative projects and things, it may be better to go back to something that you have left already rather than starting something new. Now, if we're really going to understand Venus retrograde, we have to understand that there's an 8-year cycle of her retrogrades, about every 19 months, right? So the pattern that she traces out in the sky is exactly like the pattern you drew when you were drawing stars in elementary school, little 5-pointed stars. So her first retrograde point will be here. The next one will be down here. The next one up here, across, boom, and then back to almost the same spot she was 8 years ago. So it traces out one of those stars. Here we have my high-tech visuals. We start here, come down to there, come back up over here, across, down, and like this. And we get one of these stars, right? Elementary school, you got they taught you how to draw a star. Wasn't that cool? And it was pretty easy to do. Now, from this point, the next time Venus gets to retrograde at that point, about 8 years later, it happens over here, and it comes like this. And so, and I won't go on with it, but if you had a spirograph when you were a kid, it traces out a pattern just like that. If you look online, you'll see all these wonderful Venus retrograde stars, sort of flowering stars that describe her retrograde motion. Absolutely wonderful, but I don't want to violate anybody's copyrights by stealing them. So you have to go find them yourself. Anyway, the point is this on a practical level. Because Venus retrogrades at the same point relatively every 8 years, just moving back a little bit, we have a resonance with a prior retrograde. In this case, it is the retrograde that took place in the summer of 2015. This year, Venus stations to retrograde at 28 Leo. Back then, she stationed to retrograde at 0 degrees Virgo, but essentially going through the same part of the zodiac. Resonance is not the same thing as same thing. It's not equality. It means that there's a resonance with what happened back then. So if you want to look back to 2015, there is your point of resonance. There's your point that is telling you this is something about what was going on in your life then that is again getting revisited with this Venus retrograde. That having been said, because Venus was retrograde, don't get all excited because probably nothing was happening because Venus was retrograde. So it's not like you can look back and say, wow, yeah, that was the great time that I did. Probably not, but maybe. Anyway, whatever was happening, whatever the emotional considerations around that time were, a resonance, not an equality, but a resonance with that time. Now, during her retrograde, Venus will make a few important aspects. The two major ones that I'm going to talk about. The rest of them you get on the monthly forecast, the weekly forecast. We don't have to bother ourselves with it right now because, you're going to forget. You're going to forget. On August 9th, retrograde Venus will square Uranus. Uranus is in her home sign of Taurus. And so this sort of, we have to make changes. We have to mix things up in relationship. Well, Venus is retrograde, so already we're reconsidering making choices, deciding what we value in relationship. And Uranus is just adding a little bit of energy. And on August 22nd, when best friend Jupiter squares Venus, or Venus squares best friend Jupiter, Also in Taurus, in Venus's home sign, we again get this little burst of energy, this little sense of I can do it. This August aspect period there, the 9th through the 22nd, sort of a very active phase of Venus's retrograde. This is the period of time when we'll really be going back and reconsidering things. If anything is going to happen during Venus retrograde, and there's no guarantee that it's going to, probably going to happen around these dates, the 9th and the 22nd of August. As we get going forward from that period of time, when Venus leaves the shadow of her retrograde, she will be aspecting these planets again. And actually, the table has been set in late June and early July when she aspected them going forward. And so probably, the issues or the thoughts or the feelings or whatever they are probably already on the table. And we have a more active phase in August, and then resolution as we get through September. Will be just right about the end of September will Venus make her last square to Uranus. And that would probably describe the period of time where you kind of know what was going on. Activity wise, probably until Venus gets out of her shadow around October 6th, very possibly not a lot will happen. So take this time, whether it's romance or finance, whether it's creative projects, aesthetics, anything having to do with pleasure and indulgence, take this time right now, Venus retrograde, back off a little bit, live your life. You don't have to have like Spartan, existence where you're not really indulging in anything, but dial it back a little bit. Keep your expectations lower. Dial things back a little bit. Okay. I know for most of us in the Northern Hemisphere, this is happening in the summertime. And who wants to dial back their pleasures in the summertime? Those of you who are in the Southern Hemisphere, well, you have a little bit easier time of it because it's winter. Still in all, who wants to dial back on pleasures for 40 days, plus or minus the shadow anyway? But it's a good idea. Appreciate what you have. There's no reason that this needs to be onerous and terrible and a burden upon you. It really isn't about that at all. But, the wind is not at your back when it comes to starting up new Venusian things, and you should be aware of that. But, as I said, the opportunity arises. See what happens.